Kia ora koutou from Auckland, New Zealand. I'm going to talk today about poetic representation of interviews and one of the challenges of this. And for me, in my poetic representation in my research, one key dilemma was between creative wordplay and ethical representation. So poetic representation is a creative form of data presentation and analysis. A researcher selects utterances from an interviewee's talk and arranges them on the page, rehousing them from a spoken context to a written one. The researcher creates poem-like compositions from the words of interviewees, bringing their own emphasis through the use of titles, line edges, endings, and white spaces. According to Glesney, poetic representation approximates poetry through the concentrated language of the interviewee, shaped by the researcher to give pleasure and truth, end quote. It makes a creature that contains both the interviewee's words and the researcher's artistic presence, and a third voice that is neither the interviewee's or the researcher's, but a combination of both. And the use of this poetic representation in qualitative research has grown exponentially since the publication of Laurel Richardson's now classic poem, Louisa May's Story of Her Life. So poetic representation can enact a variety of research aims. And from these different methods flow particular aims. In my work, I focus less on representing the speech patterns of the person, which was actually Richardson's original intent. But I focused on poetic representation as a form of data analysis to condense and order the data as a way of presenting the data in an evocative form. And all these aims related specifically to my research questions. In my doctoral research, I investigated how poetry therapy might benefit bereaved people grieving the loss of a partner. I engaged 8 participants in this poetry therapy and interviewed them about the outcome of the poetry therapy on how they remembered their lost love partner. I chose poetic representation as a way to condense and distill the data from 8 interviews into 16 poems, 16 poetic representations. I was drawn to it because of its resonance with the poetry therapy and the way it can humanize participants who one can imagine speaking, and I wanted to create a text that would resonate with the reader. So my method was to listen to the interview recordings again, listening for themes in the interviewee's talk. When I heard a particular theme that related to the research questions, I made a cut around a short story in the talk. So short stories can be heard within an overall spoken narrative. These are stories with a beginning, middle, and end, and connect to larger themes. In the interviews, I heard a story about the effect of the poetry therapy. I selected this part and arranged it on the page in lines, pairing it back and adding a title. I'm showing you in the PowerPoints a poem now, and then the transcript I wrote the poem from. I try to represent their speaking very accurately, not picking utterances from across the transcript and juxtaposing them as others have done, but making a cut around a whole short story and carrying this onto the page. And I think one of the dilemmas in creating poetic representations is the tension between the researcher representing interviewees' words with care and accuracy, and also the newness that can be created through the researcher's selection and arrangement. And this is, as I said, the tension between wordplay and ethical representation. Creating poetic representation reminds me of a cento. A cento is a poem where a poet takes lines from other poets' work and creates their own poem. Various lines or patches are sewn together to make a literary patchwork, a new garment. In poetic representation, a researcher makes a cut around the interviewee's words and composes them again, stitching them together so that the participant could recognize their words, but a subtly new garment is made, which shows the researcher's hand in this. So a question: how much poetic license can a poetic representation researcher use in their work to create their texts? In my work, as I said, I was seeking to accurately represent the speaking of the interviewees, and this was part of my ethical commitment to centralize their speaking. That's why I made a cut around the whole short story, not just taking up a line here and there. I imagined participants being able to recognise their speaking in the poem, and I wondered whether they would see their words as strange or familiar. In this part of the research, I didn't specifically structure a feedback loop by asking participants what they made of my poetic representation. This was because I'd already done that exactly with the poetry therapy. I'd composed it from their speaking about their lost love partner, and then I'd sent it back to them. However, when it came to the interviews about what the effects of the poetry therapy was, I did send participants the transcript for them to comment on and check. It would have added another whole tranche of data had I gained their responses to the actual poetic representations I'd written. But I did have the participants strongly in my mind when I created these poetic representations. I wanted the words of the poems to be familiar to them, and so accuracy was one of the pulls I experienced. The other was a desire to create poem-like compositions. So, what is a poem? A poem is the arrangement of language and sharpened lines of oral music, which, when read, resonates together and creates a harmonic effect. Poetry is about compression of words in an attempt to evoke meaning and move the reader. And looking back on the work of other poetic inquirers, some emphasize poetic techniques of repetition and experimentation in how poetic representations are made. Glesney, for example, created her own rules for creating poetic representations, where she could pull the interviewee's phrases from anywhere in the transcript, she said, and juxtapose them, but she had to keep enough of the interviewee's words together to represent their speaking rhythm, their way of saying things. Butler-Kisber immersed herself in the transcript, seeking to allow themes to pop out, to pull out the phrases and words that will breathe life into the poem, and to use poetic license, she says, to craft the text. I also sought to craft the text poetically by highlighting particular phrases through line endings and titles and last lines, as well as using a variety of form on the page. I played with their words through form. This was where I took up creativity in the creation of poetic representation. I suggest that this intensified the meaning of participants' words and added elements of newness to the utterances. And here I brought forward my presence as a researcher and how I crafted the text. Conversely, New Zealand poetic inquirer Schoon focused less on retaining the meaning context of the interviewee speaking and more on highly creative play with their utterances. He wrote poems from participants speaking, poems in which he took up their words and made new meaning of them. Then he offered that poem back to the participant to reflect on. In one example, Schoon cut words and phrases out of the transcript and then arranged them into couplets in his words. He moved the words and phrases around freely in order to experiment with different combinations. Rather than having participants clearly recognize their own speaking, his aim was for them to encounter their own words made strange, for them to read their words differently through his radical rearrangement of it. This is an example of stitching a new garment. Schoon unshackled the meaning and context from those words and re-meaninged them. In his work, he moves towards the highly creative end of the spectrum. In work, he doesn't call poetic representation, but rather writing found poetry in a poetic inquiry. The invitation for me in seeing his work is in how to hold on to the desire for accurate representation while taking up creative play. One question I ask myself is, how transformative for a participant is the poetic researcher wanting their work to be? How different from the first speaker? How strange? The counter-argument to accurate representation is the notion that through the change from speaking to writing, language is already in play. Across context, an utterance loses meaning and gains meaning. Even in how I represented my participants' words, adding a title, paring back the lines, I intensified meaning. So data is not a fixed nugget. It flows, it moves, losing meaning, gaining new meaning. Can we fill the participants' utterances with our own intentions? Do we need to be faithful to the interviewee's words for what they mean in one context, or can we see that the words themselves take on a new hue in a different context? Ultimately, I'm advocating for holding the value of accurate representation of participants' words and also taking up poetic license. That is, the freedom to depart from the conventional rules of language in order to create an effect. to rearrange the words in a different order, perhaps, than in the original text, as Ben Ryan says, and in some cases using poetic devices such as repetition, pauses, line length, and spacing to intensify meaning. Any research project contains tensions between various virtues and aims. A researcher drawing on Richardson's poetic representation has to navigate tensions between poetry and representation, between art and play on the one hand, and ethics and power on the other. I'm not offering answers to this dilemma, but I'm describing my approach. I sought to continue to hold the line in representing participants' words accurately while longing to be freer, to be more of a poet and create a new garment for their words by stitching the utterances together differently. But the question I was left with was, would this be for my creative purposes or the purposes of the research? Or both? In wanting to represent their words accurately, I chose to restrain the poet and prioritise the researcher in this case. Another research project might invite a different kind of poetic representation, a different experimentation. As Glesney says, in the interest of creativity and experimentation, or in responsiveness to those interviewed, I might create different rules next time, and the poetic vignettes would assume different forms. End quote. What remains with me is a sense of the creative possibilities of poetic representation for those researchers wanting to engage artistically and ethically in a meaningful presentation of human complexity. Thank you very much.